Across the world, long before history was written, people shaped stone, earth, and landscape for reasons deeper than survival. They built without kings, without machines, without certainty, yet their structures still stand where memory should have faded. These are not ruins of one culture or one time. They are echoes of a shared human instinct to mark place, time, belief, and belonging. What you're about to see is not a list of monuments. It is a journey through how humanity first learned to build meaning into the Kerma de Fufa, Sudan. Long before the pyramids of Egypt dominated the imagination of the ancient world, a powerful kingdom rose along the Nile far to the south. Its monuments were not made of stone, but of mud brick. Its cities did not imitate Egypt, nor did they exist in its shadow. They developed alongside it, independently, confidently, and on their own terms. At the heart of this forgotten civilization stands the Kerma de Fufa. The Kerma de Fufa rises abruptly from the flat landscape of northern Sudan, near the third cataract of the Nile. Even today, it feels out of place. A massive, irregular tower of sun-baked brick surrounded by open ground. It is not a palace, not a fortress, not a tomb. It is something older and more complex, a ceremonial structure built by one of Africa's earliest urban societies. Kerma was the capital of the Kingdom of Kush during its earliest phase, flourishing between roughly 2500 and 1500 BCE. At a time when Egypt was building pyramids and consolidating dynastic rule, Kerma emerged as a rival power controlling trade routes, gold resources, cattle wealth, and access to the African interior. This was not a peripheral culture. It was a center. The Defufa itself is the most visible remnant of this world. Built entirely from mud brick, it once stood over 20 meters high, with thick walls that still survive despite thousands of years of erosion. Mud brick may appear fragile, but in the Nile environment, it was a deliberate and effective choice. Easy to repair, thermally stable, and well-suited to monumental construction, it allowed Kerma's builders to shape space on a massive scale. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Defufa functioned as a temple or ceremonial center. Its interior contains multiple chambers, stairways, and elevated platforms. These spaces were not designed for large crowds. Instead, they appear restricted, controlled, and hierarchical. Movement within the structure was likely ritualized, guiding participants upward and inward. This verticality is significant. In a landscape defined by the horizontal flow of the Nile, rising above the ground carried symbolic meaning. Elevation separated sacred space from daily life. The Defufa did not reach toward the sky like later pyramids, but it asserted presence through mass and enclosure rather than height alone. Around the Defufa lay the city of Kerma itself, a dense urban center with houses, workshops, storage areas, and burial grounds. Excavations have revealed evidence of advanced craft production, including pottery of remarkable quality, metalworking, and long-distance trade. Goods from Egypt, the Red Sea, and sub-Saharan Africa passed through Kerma, making it a key node in ancient exchange networks. The royal cemeteries associated with Kerma are among the most striking in ancient Africa. Massive burial mounds, surrounded by human and animal sacrifices, suggest a complex belief system centered on kingship, power, and the afterlife. These practices differed sharply from Egyptian customs, reinforcing the idea that Kerma followed its own cultural logic rather than copying its northern neighbor. For centuries, Egypt viewed Kerma as both a trading partner and a threat. Textual sources from Egypt describe Nubia as wealthy, dangerous, and difficult to control. Eventually, during the New Kingdom period, Egypt launched military campaigns deep into Nubia. Kerma was conquered, its elites displaced, and its monuments repurposed or abandoned. The Defufa survived this collapse precisely because of its material. Unlike stone monuments that invited reuse and dismantling, mud brick structures were often left alone. Over time, wind and sand partially buried the building, preserving its core. When modern archaeologists first excavated Kerma in the 20th century, the significance of the Defufa was not immediately recognized. Early scholarship, shaped by colonial perspectives, underestimated the complexity of sub-Saharan African societies. Kerma was long described as a peripheral culture influenced by Egypt, rather than a civilization in its own right. This interpretation has since been overturned. Today, Kerma is recognized as one of the earliest true urban centers in Africa, with monumental architecture, centralized authority, and distinct cultural identity. The Dafufa stands as direct evidence of that autonomy. Standing before the structure today, its silence is striking. There are no inscriptions to explain its purpose, no reliefs depicting gods or rulers. Meaning here is carried by scale, layout, and placement. The building does not tell a story, it asserts one. As the opening chapter of this journey, the Kerma Dafufa sets the tone. It reminds us that the ancient world was not shaped by a single line of progress, flowing outward from familiar civilizations. Multiple centers of power, belief, and innovation existed simultaneously, often overlooked because their monuments were built from earth rather than stone. The Dafufa challenges modern assumptions about what endures. Talatí de Dalt, Menorca, Spain. On the island of Menorca, far from the great river valleys and imperial centers of the ancient world, stone rises quietly from the ground. There are no towering walls, no palaces, no inscriptions proclaiming power. Instead, massive blocks stand in careful balance, arranged with purpose but without explanation. This is Talatí de Dalt, one of the most revealing sites of the Talayotic culture, and a place where architecture, ritual, and community merged into a single lived landscape. Talatí de Dalt dates primarily to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, roughly between 1300 and 500 BCE. At this time, Menorca was home to an island society that developed largely in isolation. There were contacts with the wider Mediterranean, but no evidence of colonization or direct control by major powers. What emerged here was a culture shaped by limited land, shared resources, and collective decision-making. The site is not a city in the conventional sense. It is a settlement composed of several architectural elements, each serving a different role within community life. The most prominent of these are the talayot, the Taula sanctuary, and surrounding domestic structures. Together, they form a coherent spatial system rather than a collection of independent buildings. The talayot is a massive stone tower, circular in plan, built from large limestone blocks stacked without mortar. Its walls are thick, its interior space limited. Unlike fortifications elsewhere in Europe, talayots show little evidence of military function. Their entrances are small, their vantage points restricted. Instead, they appear to have served as communal markers, places of gathering, visibility, and shared identity. Talatí de Dalt's talayot is positioned deliberately within the settlement. It anchors space rather than defends it. From here, paths radiate outward toward homes, storage areas, and ritual zones. This suggests that the talayot functioned as a social center, a reference point around which daily life was organized. Nearby stands the Taula sanctuary, the most distinctive feature of Menorcan archaeology. A taula consists of a vertical stone slab topped by a horizontal capstone, forming a T-shape. At Talatí de Dalt, the taula is partially collapsed, but its original form remains clear. Surrounding it is a horseshoe-shaped enclosure built from stone walls. The purpose of the taula has been debated for decades. It is not structural in the practical sense. It does not support a roof or enclosed space efficiently. Its value lies in symbolism. Excavations around taulas have uncovered animal bones, pottery, and evidence of fire, indicating ritual activity. These were places of offering, gathering, and ceremony. The orientation of the Taula sanctuary is significant. Many taulas across Menorca align toward the southern sky, where the moon and certain stars reach their highest points. While precise astronomical function remains uncertain, it is clear that sky observation played a role in ritual life. The taula did not point inward toward authority. It pointed outward toward the cosmos. Talatí de Dalt also includes domestic structures known as navetas, oval or kidney-shaped buildings with thick stone walls. These were living spaces, storage areas, and workrooms. Their construction emphasizes durability and thermal stability, crucial in an island environment with limited timber and seasonal extremes. What emerges from the layout is a society organized around shared spaces rather than hierarchy. There are no elite residences, no monumental tombs within the settlement itself. Architecture here does not elevate individuals above the group. It reinforces participation. This absence of overt hierarchy is one of the most striking aspects of Talayotic culture. Power, if it existed, was expressed communally. Ritual spaces were accessible. Central structures were shared. This does not imply a lack of complexity. On the contrary, maintaining such balance over centuries required strong social norms and cooperation. Menorca's isolation shaped this worldview. Resources were finite. Overexploitation would have been catastrophic. Archaeological evidence suggests careful land management, animal husbandry, and controlled use of stone. The island society endured because it adapted collectively rather than expanding aggressively. Talati de Dalt also reveals continuity. The site was used, modified, and rebuilt across generations. Stones were repositioned, walls repaired, ritual areas maintained. This long-term engagement with place created memory embedded in architecture. The settlement was not static. It evolved without abandoning its core structure. External influences did arrive eventually. Phoenician and later Roman contact introduced new materials and ideas. Yet, Talaitic architecture persisted long after contact began. This resilience suggests that external trade did not immediately dismantle local belief systems. Identity remained anchored in stone. Standing within the Tala enclosure today, the experience is subtle but powerful. The stones do not overwhelm. They frame space. Light moves differently here. Sound feels contained. The vertical slab draws the eye upward, while the surrounding walls curve inward. It is an architecture designed to focus attention rather than impress. Talati de Dalt challenges familiar narratives of ancient progress. Here, complexity did not lead to empire. Monumentality did not lead to conquest. Instead, architecture served as a stabilizing force, reinforcing continuity, cooperation, and shared ritual. As the second chapter in this journey, Talati de Dalt expands the story introduced at Kerma. It shows that ancient complexity emerged not only in river valleys and trade empires, but also on small islands shaped by restraint. These stones were not raised to dominate others. They were raised to hold a community together. The builders left no written explanations, no myths carved into walls. What survives is pattern, placement, and repetition. And through them, a society reveals itself. The Jericho Stone Tower, West Bank. At the edge of the Jordan Valley, near one of the lowest points on Earth, a mound of layered earth rises above a fertile plain fed by ancient springs. This is Tel es Sultan, the site of ancient Jericho. Beneath its surface lies a structure so old that it reshapes how we understand the origins of architecture, community, and time itself. At its center stands the Jericho Stone Tower, a monument built long before writing, kings, or cities as we normally define them. The Jericho Stone Tower dates to around 8000 BCE, during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. This places it more than 10,000 years ago, at a moment when human societies were undergoing one of the most profound transitions in history. People were beginning to settle permanently, cultivating plants, domesticating animals, and reshaping landscapes that had once been crossed only seasonally. Jericho was among the earliest places where this experiment in permanence succeeded. What survives today is a massive circular stone tower, roughly 9 meters tall and 9 meters in diameter, built from undressed limestone blocks. Its walls are thick, solid, and carefully laid. Inside, a narrow staircase climbs upward, cut into the interior and rising in steep steps toward what was once an upper platform. This is not a casual construction. It is deliberate, monumental, and extraordinarily early. The tower was originally embedded within a stone wall that surrounded the settlement. Together, they formed the earliest known large-scale stone architecture in human history. For decades, this combination led scholars to assume a defensive purpose. Walls and towers, after all, suggest protection. But closer examination complicates this interpretation. Jericho at this time shows little evidence of warfare. Weapons are scarce. Trauma on human remains doesn't indicate frequent conflict. The wall itself may have functioned as flood control, protecting the settlement from seasonal torrents descending from nearby hills. If so, the tower's role becomes less obvious. The staircase inside the tower offers a clue. It is steep, narrow, and oriented toward a specific point on the horizon. When researchers analyzed its alignment, they found that it corresponds closely with the setting sun during the summer solstice, disappearing behind a nearby mountain ridge. This alignment suggests that the tower may have served a symbolic or ritual function tied to seasonal cycles. If this interpretation is correct, the tower was not built primarily to keep people out, but to mark time. It would have stood as a reference point, anchoring the community's understanding of seasonal change. In an early agricultural society, knowing when seasons turned mattered deeply. Planting, harvesting, and storage depended on it. The effort required to build the tower reinforces this idea. Hundreds of tons of stone had to be quarried, transported, and stacked by hand. This was not the work of a small family or a brief project. It required coordination, planning, and shared purpose across a sizable community. People invested in this structure because it mattered collectively. Jericho itself was already a large settlement by Neolithic standards, home to hundreds, possibly thousands of people. Houses were circular, built from mud brick, clustered closely together. Storage pits indicate surplus production. This was a society capable of long-term planning, not just daily survival. The tower rises from within this domestic landscape, not apart from it. It was not isolated on a hill or reserved for elites. It stood among homes, visible to all. This placement suggests inclusion rather than restriction. Whatever its meaning, it was meant to be shared. Burial practices at Jericho add another layer of interpretation. Archaeologists uncovered human skulls that had been removed, plastered, and modeled with facial features, including eyes made from shells. These skulls were kept within homes, suggesting a strong emphasis on ancestors and memory. The living and the dead coexisted within the same spaces. In this context, the tower may have functioned as more than a calendar. It may have been a symbolic axis connecting generations, seasons, and landscape. A place where time was not abstract, but embodied in stone and movement. Climbing the staircase would have been an act, not just a view. The tower's height is also significant. In a flat valley, rising 9 meters would have changed perspective dramatically. From its top, one could see the surrounding plain, the springs that sustained the settlement, and the mountains that framed the horizon. This elevated viewpoint may have reinforced a sense of place and control over environment. Importantly, the tower was eventually filled in and buried, while the settlement continued to exist. This suggests that its function changed or ended, but not through destruction. The community chose to cover it. This deliberate act implies closure rather than failure. Why would such a monument be buried? Possibly because the beliefs or practices associated with it evolved. As agriculture became more stable, the need for such a marker may have diminished, or new forms of ritual replaced old ones. What matters is that the structure was respected enough to be sealed rather than dismantled. The Jericho Stone Tower forces a reconsideration of how and why humans first built monumental architecture. It predates temples, pyramids, and palaces by millennia. It was built by people without metal tools, writing, or formal hierarchy as we understand it. And yet, it reflects complex thinking. This was not architecture born of power imposed from above. It was architecture born of cooperation, a shared decision to invest time, labor, and resources into something that did not directly produce food or shelter, but meaning. The Tarxian temples, Malta. On the island of Malta, where limestone lies close to the surface and the Mediterranean surrounds every horizon, a group of stone structures marks one of the earliest and most sophisticated ritual landscapes in human history. They do not rise dramatically. They do not announce themselves from afar. Instead, they reveal complexity through layout, carving, and repetition. These are the Tarxian temples. The Tarxian temples date to roughly 3150 to 2500 BCE, during Malta's temple period, a time when the island supported a dense population engaged in agriculture, ritual, and large-scale stone construction. These temples were not isolated monuments. They formed part of a wider network of megalithic sites across the island, all sharing similar architectural principles but differing in detail. Tarxian represents the culmination of this tradition. Unlike later temples built as single unified structures, Tarxian is a complex of multiple interconnected buildings constructed over generations. New temples were added beside older ones, sometimes sharing walls, sometimes reworking earlier spaces. This layering reflects continuity rather than replacement. Ritual practice evolved without abandoning its foundations. The basic architectural form is consistent. Curved walls define clover-shaped chambers arranged along a central axis. Doorways are narrow, deliberately restricting movement. Floors were paved with stone. Walls were carefully smoothed, and in some cases carved with reliefs. This was not improvised construction. It was controlled, measured, and repeated. One of Tarxian's most striking features is its decoration. Unlike many prehistoric structures that rely purely on form, Tarxian incorporates symbolic imagery directly into its architecture. Spiral motifs, plant-like patterns, and animal reliefs are carved into stone blocks. These designs are not random. They appear consistently across the complex, suggesting a shared, symbolic language. Animal imagery is especially prominent. Reliefs depicting bulls, pigs, and sheep are positioned near altars and thresholds. These animals were central to Neolithic life on Malta, providing food, labor, and raw materials. Their presence in ritual space suggests offerings, sacrifice, or symbolic association with fertility and abundance. Perhaps the most famous fragment discovered at Tarxian is the lower portion of a colossal stone figure, often interpreted as a goddess or priestly figure. The sculpture shows a massive skirt with pleated folds, carved at a scale far larger than life. The head and upper body were never found, leaving interpretation open. What matters is not identity, but emphasis. Scale here communicates importance without narrative. The interior spaces of the temples were not designed for large crowds. Chambers are intimate, enclosed, and acoustically contained. This suggests rituals involving limited participants rather than public spectacle. Movement through the complex would have been slow, guided, and sequential. Architecture here shaped experience. Altars carved from single stone blocks appear throughout the site. Some are decorated, others are plain. Their placement within chambers reinforces the idea of controlled ritual zones. These were not multi-purpose spaces. Each area had a specific function within a broader ceremonial process. The precision of construction raises questions about social organization. Moving and shaping stones weighing several tons required planning, coordination, and skilled labor. Yet there's no evidence of fortifications, elite residences, or centralized authority structures. Power at Tarxian appears to have been ritual rather than military or political. Malta's isolation makes this even more striking. The island had no metal during this period, limited timber, and finite resources, and yet its inhabitants sustained a temple-building tradition for over 1,000 years. This endurance suggests a stable belief system deeply integrated into daily life. The orientation of the temples also matters. Entrances generally face southeast, aligned with the rising sun. Light would have entered the temples at specific times, illuminating certain chambers more than others. This controlled use of light suggests ritual timing linked to solar cycles. Tarxian's relationship with death provides another clue. Nearby burial sites and evidence of ritual deposition suggest that the temples were connected to beliefs about life cycles rather than isolated acts of worship. Birth, fertility, death, and renewal were likely understood as parts of a single process. Eventually, the temple-building culture of Malta ended abruptly. By around 2500 BCE, the temples were abandoned. The reasons remain debated. Environmental degradation, resource depletion, social change, or external contact may all have played roles. What is clear is that the tradition did not gradually decline. It stopped. Later cultures did not reuse the temples. They were respected, avoided, or forgotten. Soil accumulated. Stones collapsed inward. The site remained silent until modern excavation revealed its complexity. Standing within the Tarxian temples today, the experience is subtle rather than overwhelming. Curved stone walls guide movement. Carvings catch light at certain angles. Sound behaves differently in enclosed chambers. The architecture works on the senses rather than on scale. Chenko, Peru. On a limestone outcrop overlooking the ancient capital of Cusco, the land itself appears to have been reshaped rather than built upon. There are no freestanding temples here, no towering walls or visible monuments from a distance. Instead, the stone has been carved, hollowed, folded inward. This is Chenko, one of the most enigmatic ceremonial sites of the Inca world. Chenko lies just outside Cusco, the political and symbolic heart of the Inca Empire. Its proximity is important. This was not a remote shrine meant only for pilgrims. It was part of the sacred landscape that surrounded the capital itself. Integrated into the system of huacas, places believed to possess spiritual force, Chenko wasn't built to dominate the skyline. It was designed to be entered, experienced, and interpreted through movement. The name Chenko comes from the Quechua word for labyrinth, or zigzag, a reference to the channels carved into the rock surface. These grooves twist and turn across the stone, guiding liquid, most likely water, chicha, or sacrificial blood, in deliberate paths. The exact substance remains debated, but the intention is clear. Flow mattered, direction mattered. Stone was used to control movement not of people, but of ritual action itself. At the center of the site stands a massive carved rock with niches, ledges, and symbolic cuts. Unlike Inca masonry elsewhere, where stones are shaped and fitted together, here the stone was never separated from the earth. It was transformed in place. This choice reflects a core Inca belief. Rocks were not inert material. They were living parts of the landscape. Below the carved outcrop lies a subterranean chamber, narrow, dark, and acoustically heavy. The space feels deliberately concealed. Inside are stone benches and an altar-like platform carved from the same bedrock. Light enters only indirectly. Sound behaves differently here. The chamber was not meant for gathering. It was meant for controlled. Ritual acts carried out by a few. Archaeological interpretation suggests that Chenko played a role in rites connected to death, transformation, and renewal. Some scholars believe mummified ancestors of Inca rulers were brought here for ceremonies tied to seasonal cycles. Others suggest it functioned as a place of divination or initiation. What unites these theories is transition. Chenko was a threshold space. The alignment of the site supports this idea. Certain carvings and openings correspond with solar events, particularly the solstices. At specific times of year, light strikes parts of the rock with precision, briefly illuminating features otherwise hidden in shadow. These moments would have been predictable, rare, and symbolically charged. Water also plays a central role. The carved channels on the surface suggest ritual pouring or libation. In Inca cosmology, water was not merely practical. It was sacred, tied to fertility, mountains, and the underworld. Guiding water across. Stone was a way of shaping cosmic order in miniature. Chenko's architecture is inseparable from its geology. The limestone here fractures naturally, creating planes and edges that Inca builders exploited rather than erased. This approach contrasts with the later imperial styles that emphasize perfected geometry. At Chenko, the natural and the constructed blur together. The site also reflects the Inca understanding of the three realms of existence: the upper world of the sky, the middle world of the living, and the underworld associated with ancestors and origins. Chenko incorporates all three: open platforms under the sky, carved surfaces at ground level, and closed chambers below. After the Spanish conquest, Chenko's meaning was deliberately disrupted. Colonial sources describe the destruction of huacas around Cusco as part of religious suppression. Some carvings were damaged. Ceremonial functions ceased. The site was stripped of its original role, but not erased. What remains today is fragmentary yet powerful. Without written records from the Inca themselves, interpretation relies on stone, placement, and context. Chenko does not explain its rituals. It enforces them through design. Standing at the site now, the experience is intimate rather than monumental. The stone feels close. Movement feels guided. Even without ritual, the architecture still shapes behavior. One slows down. One follows the curves. One notices shadow and silence. Chenko challenges the idea that religious architecture must rise upward to assert power. Here, power is expressed through control of experience, through carving rather than construction, through intimacy rather than scale. As the fifth chapter in this journey, Chenko deepens the pattern already emerging. Ancient societies did not always build outward or upward. Sometimes they built inward, into stone, into landscape, into perception. Chenko was not meant to be seen by everyone. It was meant to be understood by those who moved through it at the right time, in the right way. Its meaning was enacted, not displayed. The rituals are gone. The chants are silent. But the stone remains shaped, deliberate, and unresolved. Here, just beyond the walls of Cusco, the Inca left behind a place that still resists simplification. A carved landscape where belief, stone, and movement were fused into a single, enduring form. Sechenbajo, Peru. In the arid Casma Valley of coastal Peru, where the desert meets seasonal rivers flowing from the Andes, a series of low platforms and sunken spaces stretches quietly across the ground. There are no towering pyramids here, no dramatic skyline. Instead, the land itself has been shaped, leveled, and organized with precision. This is Sechenbajo, one of the oldest known ceremonial complexes in the Americas, and a site that fundamentally alters how early civilization is understood. Sechenbajo predates the Inca, the Moche, and even the famous Norte Chico civilization to the south. Radiocarbon dating places its earliest construction phases around 3500 BCE, making it contemporary with the earliest monument builders anywhere in the world. At this time, there were no cities in the conventional sense. no metal tools, no written language. And yet, people here were already shaping large ceremonial spaces that required long-term planning and collective labor. The architecture of Sechin Bagyo is subtle but deliberate. The site consists of rectangular plazas, stepped platforms, and thick adobe walls arranged along clear axes. Some of these spaces are sunken below ground level, creating enclosed environments that separate participants from the surrounding landscape. Movement into these plazas would have been intentional, guiding people downward and inward. This design choice matters. Sunken plazas appear repeatedly in early Indian architecture, and Sechin Bagyo represents one of their earliest known uses. These spaces were not defensive. They were not domestic. They were places for gathering, ritual, and shared experience. Architecture here shapes behavior rather than shelters it. One of the most striking discoveries at Sechin Bagyo is its sculpted friezes. Carved into plastered walls, these reliefs depict human figures, animals, and abstract forms rendered in low relief. Some figures appear to be holding staffs or objects. Others are fragmented, overlapping, or stylized in ways that resist easy interpretation. These images are among the oldest known examples of monumental relief art in the Americas. The friezes were not placed for constant viewing. Many were later covered by additional construction phases, buried beneath new walls and floors. This intentional burial suggests that renewal, not permanence, was part of the site's ritual logic. Old spaces were not destroyed. They were sealed and built over, preserving memory beneath new layers. This pattern of rebuilding reveals a cyclical understanding of time. Rather than maintaining a single sacred structure indefinitely, the builders of Sechin Bagyo renewed their ceremonial spaces through reconstruction. Each phase respected what came before while redefining it. Architecture here functioned as a living process. The labor required to construct Sechin Bagyo was substantial. Adobe bricks had to be produced in large quantities, carried and laid systematically. Earth had to be moved to create sunken spaces. Walls were plastered, smoothed, and decorated. None of this was necessary for survival alone. It reflects organized cooperation guided by shared belief. What is especially important is what Sechin Bagyo lacks. There's no clear evidence of elite residences, palaces, or centralized political authority at this early stage. Monumental construction appears before signs of rigid hierarchy. This challenges long-standing assumptions that large architecture requires kings or coercive power. Instead, Sechin Bagyo suggests a model of early complexity rooted in ritual gathering. People came together not under command, but under shared purpose. Ceremony, rather than authority, may have been the driving force behind construction. The site's location reinforces this interpretation. The Chasma Valley offered access to both marine and agricultural resources. People here likely practiced mixed subsistence strategies, combining fishing, farming, and gathering. This ecological balance may have supported periodic large gatherings tied to seasonal cycles. Water, though scarce, played a role in shaping settlement. Seasonal rivers created moments of abundance and risk. Ritual architecture may have functioned as a way to mediate these uncertainties, reinforcing social cohesion during times of change. Later phases of Sechin Bagyo show increasing complexity and expansion. Over time, the site grew, incorporating larger platforms and more elaborate spaces. Nearby sites, including Sechin, reflect related traditions, suggesting a broader cultural landscape rather than an isolated experiment. The violent imagery seen at Sechin has often dominated interpretations of the region. Sechin Bagyo complicates that narrative. Its earliest phases emphasize gathering, enclosure, and renewal rather than conflict. This suggests that ritual complexity preceded social violence, not the other way around. When Sechin Bagyo was eventually abandoned, it was not erased. Its structures were left standing, gradually covered by sand and soil. Unlike later monumental centers, it was not extensively reused or rebuilt by subsequent cultures. Its early significance remained localized and eventually forgotten. Dún Charlabhaig, Duncarlaway, Scotland. On the Isle of Lewis, where Atlantic winds sweep across peat and stone and the sea is never far from view, a circular tower rises from the hillside. It is heavy, compact, and inward-looking. There are no decorative reliefs, no inscriptions, no obvious symbolism carved into its walls, yet its presence is unmistakable. This is Dún Carlaway, one of the best preserved rocks in Scotland, and a structure that still resists simple explanation. Dún Carloway was built during the Iron Age, likely between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. At this time, northern Scotland was home to communities that did not build cities, write texts, or leave monumental temples. Instead, they constructed brocks, massive, circular, dry stone towers found almost exclusively in Scotland. Their purpose remains debated, and Dún Carloway sits at the center of that debate. From the outside, the broch appears solid and defensive. Its walls are several meters thick, built from carefully stacked stone without mortar. The entrance is narrow and low, forcing anyone entering to stoop. This alone suggests control. Movement here was deliberate. Access was restricted by design, but once inside, the structure reveals complexity rather than brute defense. The interior opens into a tall, hollow space surrounded by thick walls, containing passages, chambers, and stairways embedded within the stone itself. These intramural spaces are one of the defining features of broch architecture. They are not accidental voids. They were planned from the beginning. A stone staircase winds upward inside the wall, leading to upper levels that no longer survive. These levels would have been supported by wooden floors, creating a multi-story interior. From above, occupants could look down into the central space or outward through small openings. This vertical organization suggests long-term occupation rather than short-term refuge. The question is why such effort was invested in a single tower. Brochs required enormous labor to build. Stones had to be quarried, transported, and fitted with precision. This was not construction driven by desperation. It was a choice. Some interpretations emphasize defense. The Iron Age was not peaceful, and control of land and resources mattered. A tall, thick-walled tower would have provided protection and visibility. Yet brochs are rarely positioned at the most defensible points. Dún Carloway overlooks land and sea, but it is not perched on a cliff or surrounded by walls. Its defensive advantage is limited. Others see brochs as symbols of status. Their scale and engineering would have communicated power and authority within a dispersed landscape. Building a broch may have been a way for a family or group to assert prominence without forming an urban center. In this view, architecture replaced hierarchy expressed through cities or monuments. There's also evidence that brochs were lived-in spaces. Hearths, storage areas, and domestic debris suggest everyday activity. Dún Carloway was not empty or ceremonial alone. It was inhabited. People cooked, slept, stored goods, and moved through its passages daily. The tower was part of life, not separate from it. The surrounding landscape supports this interpretation. Nearby are traces of field systems, smaller structures, and pathways. Dún Carloway functioned within a broader settlement network rather than standing alone as a fortress. Its presence organized space around it. The design of the entrance reinforces controlled interaction rather than isolation. A guard cell sits just inside the doorway, opening into the passage. This space could be used to monitor entry, but it also suggests social regulation. Not everyone entered freely. Access depended on relationship, not force. Light inside the broch would have been limited. Narrow openings admit small amounts of daylight. Fire would have been essential, not only for warmth and cooking, but for visibility. Smoke management within such a tall, enclosed space would have required careful control, indicating practical understanding of airflow. Dún Carloway also reflects adaptation to environment. The thick stone walls provided insulation against cold and wind. The circular form distributed pressure evenly, increasing stability. In a landscape with limited timber, stone offered durability and permanence. Unlike later castles, brochs were not part of a feudal system. There were no armies garrisoned here, no written authority enforcing control. Power, if expressed, was local and personal. Architecture substituted for institutions that did not yet exist. The broch tradition eventually ended. By the early centuries CE, brochs were abandoned or repurposed. The reasons remain unclear. Social change, new forms of settlement, or shifts in economy may all have played roles. Dún Carloway shows signs of later reuse, but its original function did not continue indefinitely. What remains today is a shell, but a remarkably intact one. The walls still rise high. The stairway remains climbable. One can still trace the internal passages carved into stone. This preservation allows a rare experience of Iron Age architecture from within, not just as ruins on the ground. Standing inside Dún Carloway, the scale feels intimate rather than overwhelming. The walls curve inward. Sound echoes softly. The sky is visible above. The structure encloses without isolating. It creates a world within stone. Dun Carloway challenges the assumption that complexity requires urbanization. Here's a society capable of advanced engineering, long-term planning, and architectural innovation without cities, writing, or centralized states. Complexity took a different form. As the seventh chapter in this journey, Dun Carloway marks a shift in geography and expression. From ritual landscapes and early ceremonial centers, the story moves into domestic monumentality, architecture that was lived in, not just visited. This tower was not built to impress outsiders. It was built to function within a known world, among known people, under known conditions. Its meaning was local, practical, and symbolic all at once. The builders left no explanations, no myths carved into stone. What survives is form, thickness, passage, and height. Through these, Dun Carloway continues to pose a simple but difficult question. Why build like this? The answer may never be singular, and that uncertainty is precisely what keeps the Broch standing, centuries later, as one of the most compelling expressions of Iron Age life in the Atlantic world. Brownshill Dolmen, Ireland. On a gentle rise in County Carlow, surrounded by open fields and quiet roads, a single stone dominates the landscape. It does not form a wall. It does not enclose space. It simply rests, improbably, in the upright supports beneath it. This is Brownshill Dolmen, one of the most striking megalithic monuments in Europe, and home to the heaviest known capstone ever raised by prehistoric people. The capstone alone weighs an estimated 100 metric tons. It spans more than 6 meters, its underside hovering above the ground, supported by portal stones and smaller orthostats. There's no mortar, no metal, no reinforcement, just stone balanced on stone. The fact that it still stands forces a simple question. How was this done? And why was it worth the effort? Brownshill Dolmen dates to the Neolithic period, roughly around 3300–2900 BCE. It belongs to a class of monuments known as portal tombs, structures typically associated with burial and ritual. These tombs appear across Ireland and Western Britain, but none approach Brownshill in scale. This was not a standard example. It was an extreme one. The dolmen was originally part of a larger monument. Archaeological evidence suggests that it once supported a mound or cairn, now long eroded or removed. The stones we see today are the skeletal remains of a more complex structure. What survives is its core, the part that mattered most. Burials discovered at similar sites indicate that these tombs were used for collective interment rather than individual graves. The dead were placed within a chamber beneath the capstone, possibly over extended periods. This suggests that the monument was revisited repeatedly, its meaning renewed with each use. Death here was not hidden. It was integrated into the landscape. The sheer scale of the capstone changes how the monument is understood. Smaller portal tombs could be explained through gradual effort. Brownshill requires something more. Moving, lifting, and positioning a stone of this size would have demanded coordinated labor from a large group, careful planning, and precise timing. This was not an act of improvisation. Importantly, Neolithic Ireland had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals for hauling stone, and no metal tools. Everything depended on leverage, timber, rope, earth ramps, and human coordination. The capstone's placement was likely the culmination of a long stage process, rather than a single dramatic moment. Why commit to such excess? Function alone does not explain it. A smaller stone would have covered a burial chamber just as effectively. The decision to use one of the largest stones available in the region suggests symbolic intent. Scale itself was the message. Brownshill Dolmen would have been visible from a distance when newly built, especially if it was once covered by a mound. It marked territory, memory, and identity. In a farming society where land and lineage mattered deeply, anchoring ancestors to a specific place reinforced claims of belonging. The orientation of the tomb also matters. Many portal tombs face east or southeast, toward the rising sun. This alignment links death with renewal, night with morning. While erosion makes precise measurement difficult, Brownshill fits within this broader pattern of solar symbolism common in Neolithic Europe. The monument's location is not defensive, nor is it hidden. It sits in open land, accessible and exposed. This openness suggests communal rather than restricted use. People gathered here. Ritual was public, or at least shared. There is no evidence of permanent settlement directly beside the dolmen. Like many Neolithic tombs, Brownshill functioned as a destination rather than a dwelling. Life happened elsewhere, meaning happened here. Over time, the cairn surrounding the tomb collapsed or was dismantled, leaving the capstone dramatically exposed. This transformation may not have been intentional, but it altered the monument's impact. What was once enclosed became stark. The stone now dominates the scene in a way it may not have originally. Even in this altered state, the dolmen retains power. Standing beneath the capstone, one feels its weight immediately. The space is compressed, sound changes. The stone does not feel symbolic. It feels physical. This immediacy may be closer to the original experience than we realize. Brownshill Dolmen also raises questions about social organization. Coordinating the labor required to build it implies leadership, planning, and shared motivation. Yet there is no evidence of kings or rigid hierarchy at this time. Authority may have been situational, tied to ritual knowledge rather than permanent power. The monument outlasted the society that built it. Farming practices changed. New cultures arrived. Metal tools were introduced. And still, the stone remained. Later communities did not dismantle it. They lived around it, named it, and folded it into folklore. This endurance suggests respect. Even when original meanings were lost, the monument retained significance. It became part of the land's memory. As the 8th chapter in this journey, Brownshill Dolmen emphasizes a recurring theme. Monumentality did not require cities, armies, or writing. It required shared belief strong enough to justify extraordinary effort. This was not architecture of convenience. It was architecture of commitment. The builders of Brownshill chose a stone that pushed the limits of what was possible. They did so knowing the risk, the labor, and the time involved. That choice alone tells us that this place mattered deeply. Today, the dolmen stands incomplete, exposed and silent. Yet its message is clear. Long before history was written, people were willing to move mountains, or at least one enormous stone, to anchor memory in the earth. The names are gone. The rituals are forgotten, but the weight remains. And in that weight, Brownshill Dolmen continues to speak, not through explanation, but through presence. Jerf El Ahmar, the communal buildings, Syria. Along a bend of the Euphrates River in northern Syria, beneath layers of soil now submerged by a modern reservoir, archaeologists uncovered traces of a settlement that predates agriculture as we fully understand it. There were no temples, no palaces, no rulers carved into stone. And yet, at the center of this early community stood carefully designed communal buildings, structures that reveal how cooperation, planning, and shared belief emerged before cities, before kings, and before farming became dominant. This place is Jerf El Ahmar. Jerf El Ahmar dates to around 9500, 8700 BCE, during the pre-pottery Neolithic A and early B periods. At this time, people were still primarily hunter-gatherers, but they were beginning to settle more permanently along river systems. Jerf El Ahmar represents a moment of transition, not yet agricultural, but no longer fully mobile. The settlement itself was modest in scale. Houses were small, circular or sub-rectangular, built from mud brick and stone. But what sets Jerf El Ahmar apart is what lies at its core. Large communal buildings, distinct from domestic spaces, were deliberately placed at the center of the village. These were not homes. They were shared structures designed for collective use. Several of these communal buildings have been identified, each constructed in phases over time. They vary in form but share key features: thick walls, interior benches, central hearths, and carefully prepared floors. Some were circular, others polygonal. Their size alone distinguishes them. They could accommodate dozens of people at once. This separation between domestic and communal space is crucial. It suggests that certain activities were intentionally removed from everyday life and placed into shared, formal environments. Decision-making, ritual, storage, teaching, or seasonal gatherings may have occurred here. Whatever their exact function, these buildings represent an early investment in collective identity. One of the most remarkable structures includes a subterranean or semi-subterranean design. Entered from above, the interior space would have felt enclosed and acoustically distinct. Sound would carry differently here. Light would be controlled. These sensory effects were not accidental. Architecture was already being used to shape experience. Carved stone elements found within the buildings add another layer. Pillars, benches, and decorated blocks suggest symbolic intent. Some stones bear incised geometric patterns. Others were deliberately positioned to frame space. These are not utilitarian choices. They reflect emerging symbolic behavior expressed through architecture. Perhaps most striking is the presence of large storage facilities integrated into communal spaces. Silos capable of holding significant quantities of grain were found near or within these buildings. This indicates collective food management, shared storage, rather than individual hoarding. In a world still dependent on hunting and wild plant gathering, this was a radical shift. Such storage implies trust. It implies rules. It implies social agreements about access, distribution, and responsibility. These are the foundations of organized society, appearing long before formal political structures. Jurf El Amar also shows signs of repeated rebuilding. Communal buildings were not abandoned when they aged. They were renewed, expanded, or replaced in the same locations. This continuity suggests memory tied to place. Certain spots within the settlement mattered more than others. Importantly, there's no evidence of elite separation. No larger houses, no privileged compounds. The largest and most carefully built spaces were communal, not private. Power, if present, was expressed collectively rather than individually. The site's location along the Euphrates was strategic. The river provided water, fish, and fertile land. Seasonal abundance, likely, supported larger gatherings at certain times of year. Communal buildings may have functioned as anchors for these moments, reinforcing social cohesion during periods of change. Jurf El Amar challenges a long-held assumption in archaeology, that large communal architecture emerged only after agriculture and hierarchy. Here we see the opposite. Shared structures came first, farming followed later. This sequence suggests that cooperation was not a result of surplus. Surplus may have been a result of cooperation. People learned to gather, plan, store, and decide together before they learned to fully control food production. The site was abandoned around 8700 BCE, possibly due to environmental change or shifting settlement patterns. When modern development threatened the area, archaeologists excavated it rapidly before it disappeared beneath water. What remains today exists only in records, drawings, and reconstructed understanding. That loss makes Jurf El Ahmar even more important. It reminds us that some of the most crucial chapters in human history are fragile. They leave behind subtle traces rather than monuments meant to endure. As the 9th chapter in this journey, Jurf El Ahmar pushes the story further back than stone towers and temples. It takes us to a time when architecture was not about authority or display, but about gathering. Here, people came together not because they were commanded to, but because cooperation itself had become essential. Walls were raised not to separate, but to include. The communal buildings of Jurf El Amar represent one of humanity's earliest experiments in shared space, places where decisions, resources, and meaning were negotiated collectively. The structures are gone. The river has changed course, but the idea remains. Long before civilization was ruled, it was shared. Sambor Prehistoric, the brick temples, Cambodia. Deep in the forests of central Cambodia, scattered among trees and laterite paths, stand the remains of a city older than Angkor. Its towers are smaller, its carvings more restrained, and its layout less theatrical. Yet this place marks a decisive moment in Southeast Asian history, when sacred architecture, urban planning, and political authority were first fused into a lasting model. This is Sambor Prehistoric. Sambor Prehistoric flourished in the late 6th and early 7th centuries CE as the capital of Chenla, a polity that emerged from earlier Funan traditions. Long before Angkor Wat or Angkor Thom dominated the region, Sambor Prehistoric established the architectural and ideological foundations that later Khmer kings would expand on a monumental scale. What immediately distinguishes the site is its use of brick. Hundreds of temples were constructed primarily from baked brick rather than stone. These are not crude structures. The bricks are carefully laid, tightly fitted, and in many cases carved directly after placement. Decorative details were shaped into the brick itself, rather than added later. This technique required precision and planning. Once brick was fired and set, errors could not easily be corrected. The builders of Sambor Prehistoric understood their materials deeply. Brick was lighter than stone, easier to transport, and well-suited to forest environments. It allowed rapid construction while still conveying permanence. The temples are organized into multiple groups spread across several square kilometers. Each group centers on a principal shrine surrounded by smaller towers, all enclosed within low walls and moats. This repeated pattern reveals a deliberate urban logic rather than organic growth. Many of the shrines were dedicated to Shiva, often represented through lingas placed inside the sanctuaries. Sambor Pre Kuk is one of the earliest large-scale expressions of Hindu temple architecture in mainland Southeast Asia. Religion here was not imported wholesale. It was adapted, localized, and embedded into political authority. One of the most striking architectural features at the site is the presence of octagonal temples, a form rare in later Khmer architecture. These unusual shapes suggest experimentation rather than rigid tradition. The builders were not copying a fixed model, they were testing possibilities. Orientation mattered. Temples are carefully aligned, often facing east, linking ritual practice to the rising sun. Processional paths guided movement toward sanctuaries. Space was controlled, not chaotic. Architecture here structured how people approached the divine. Carvings at Sambor Pre Kuk are subtle but distinctive. Motifs include vegetal patterns, flying figures, and protective deities rendered in low relief. Unlike later Angkorian sculpture, which emphasizes scale and drama, these carvings are intimate and repetitive. Their power lies in consistency rather than spectacle. The city was not only religious. Evidence of habitation, water management, and infrastructure suggests that Sambor Pre Kuk functioned as a true urban center. Reservoirs and channels controlled seasonal water flow. Roads connected temple groups. The sacred and the practical were intertwined. Importantly, Sambor Pre Kuk does not present a single central monument dominating all others. Instead, authority is distributed across clusters. This reflects an early model of power, where kingship was reinforced through multiple sacred nodes, rather than one overwhelming center. Over time, political power shifted. New capitals emerged closer to the Tonle Sap region. Sambor Pre Kuk was gradually abandoned, its temples left to the forest. Unlike Angkor, it was never heavily rebuilt or reoccupied. This abandonment preserved early architectural forms that would otherwise have been overwritten. When the forest reclaimed the site, roots fractured walls and towers collapsed inward. Brick eroded more easily than stone, yet enough remains to read the plan, the intention, and the innovation. Standing among the ruins today, the experience is quiet and dispersed. There's no single viewpoint that explains everything. Temples appear suddenly between trees, then vanish again. This fragmentation mirrors the site's original logic, a sacred landscape rather than a single monument. Sambor Pre Kuk challenges the idea that Khmer greatness began with Angkor. It shows that the concepts behind Angkor, divine kingship, temple-centered urbanism, axial planning, were already present centuries earlier, expressed in brick rather than stone. It also complicates assumptions about durability. Brick temples were not meant to outlast forests forever. They were meant to function within a living city. Their endurance today is partial, but their influence was complete. As this chapter unfolds, Sambor Pre Kuk stands as a moment of origin, a place where experimentation solidified into tradition, where imported ideas became local identity, where architecture learned how to serve belief and power together. The forest is quieter now. The rituals have ended, but beneath roots and fallen brick, the blueprint of an empire remains visible. Before Angkor rose in stone, it was imagined here, in brick, in repetition, and in carefully ordered space. Bryn Celyn Du, Wales. On the island of Anglesey, where low hills roll gently toward the Irish Sea, and the landscape feels deliberately open, a grass-covered mound rises from a quiet field. From the outside, it appears simple, almost modest, but beneath the earth lies a carefully constructed stone passage leading into darkness, a space shaped not just to hold the dead, but to frame time itself. This is Bryn Celyn Du, one of the most refined Neolithic monuments in Britain. Bryn Celyn Du dates to around 3000 BCE, a period when communities across Atlantic Europe were investing extraordinary effort into monuments tied to burial, ancestry, and the movement of the sun. By this time, farming societies were well established, yet belief remained deeply connected to landscape and sky. Bryn Celyn Du reflects this connection with unusual clarity. The name Bryn Celyn Du translates roughly to the mound in the dark grove. Even linguistically, it preserves memory of enclosure, shadow, and concealment. This was never meant to be an open monument. It was meant to be entered. A narrow stone passage leads from the eastern side of the mound into a circular burial chamber. The stones are carefully placed, their surfaces smoothed by deliberate shaping rather than erosion. This was not improvised construction. It was planned, measured, and repeated according to shared knowledge. The passage is low and constricted. Movement through it requires slowing down, bending, adjusting posture. This physical restriction is not accidental. Architecture here controls experience. Entry becomes an act rather than a convenience. At the heart of the chamber once lay human remains, likely placed over time rather than in a single event. Bryncelli was not a tomb used once and sealed. It was revisited. Each entry renewed the relationship between the living and the dead. Ancestors were not removed from society. They were housed within it. What sets Bryncelli apart from many other passage tombs is its precise solar alignment. At dawn on the summer solstice, sunlight enters the passage and travels its full length, illuminating the interior chamber. For a brief moment each year, darkness is replaced by light in a space designed to contain shadow. This event would not have been subtle. In an otherwise dark chamber, the arrival of sunlight would have been dramatic, controlled, and predictable. Time was being marked not abstractly but physically, through stone, earth, and light. Such alignment required careful observation across generations. The builders needed to understand where the sun would rise on the longest day of the year, and how to orient the passage accordingly. This knowledge was not incidental. It was embedded into architecture. The presence of a freestanding pillar stone within the chamber adds another layer of meaning. The stone is carved with spiral patterns, a recurring motif in Neolithic art across Britain and Ireland. Spirals suggest movement, cycles, and continuity. Here they sit at the center of a space designed to unite death and renewal. Originally, Bryncelli may have been part of a more complex ritual landscape. Excavations have revealed evidence of earlier stone circles and standing stones nearby, some of which were deliberately dismantled or incorporated into later phases. This suggests a long continuity of sacred use, with meanings evolving rather than disappearing. The mound itself seals the structure, insulating it from sound, light, and weather. Inside, temperature and acoustics would have been noticeably different from the outside world. This separation reinforces the sense of crossing a boundary from everyday life into ritual space. Unlike later monuments built to display power, Bryncelli conceals its complexity. Nothing about its exterior announces solar precision or symbolic depth. Understanding comes only through participation, through entering, waiting, and observing. This inward focus reflects a broader Neolithic worldview. Meaning was not imposed outward. It was encountered through experience, repetition, and timing. Architecture was not a spectacle. It was a process. Over time, use of the tomb ceased. The mound collapsed partially. Stones fell. Soil accumulated. By the time modern archaeology rediscovered the site, much had been altered by centuries of weather and human activity. Yet the core design remained readable. Modern reconstruction restored parts of the mound and passage, not to romanticize the site, but to clarify its original form. Today, the solstice alignment still functions. Light still enters. The design still works. Standing inside the chamber during the summer solstice, one becomes acutely aware of intention. This is not coincidence. This is architecture acting as calendar, memory, and threshold all at once. Bryncelli challenges the idea that early monuments were crude or symbolic only in a vague sense. Here, belief is precise. Time is measured. Space is controlled. Knowledge is embedded in stone. As the 11th chapter in this journey, Bryncelli brings together themes already encountered, ancestry, ritual, solar cycles, but expresses them with remarkable restraint. There is no excess here, only what is necessary. The builders did not seek permanence through mass alone. They sought permanence through repetition. Each year, the sun would return. Each year, light would enter the chamber. Each year, the relationship between living, dead, and sky would be renewed. The people who built Bryncelli are gone. Their names are lost. Their language has changed. But their understanding of time still functions exactly as intended. Here, beneath a quiet mound on a Welsh island, the Maltese cart ruts. A megalithic network, Malta. Across the limestone plateau of Malta, lines cut into the bedrock run in pairs, diverging and converging, crossing hills, valleys, and ridges before vanishing abruptly at cliffs or disappearing beneath soil and sea. They are not roads in the modern sense. They are not walls, buildings, or monuments. And yet, they form one of the most extensive and puzzling prehistoric landscapes in Europe. This system is known collectively as the Maltese Cart Ruts. At first glance, the ruts appear simple. Two parallel grooves carved into limestone, usually about 1.1 to 1.4 meters apart. But scale changes perception. Thousands of these grooves exist across Malta and Gozo, forming dense networks that cover large portions of the islands. In some areas, dozens of ruts intersect in tight clusters, creating patterns so complex they resemble rail yards rather than pathways. The most famous concentration lies at Misra Gar el-Kbir, often called Clapham Junction. Here the bedrock is carved so extensively that individual tracks become difficult to follow. Lines overlap, split, and rejoin. Some lead nowhere. Others end at quarry edges or sheer drops into the sea. This is not casual wear. It is intentional modification of landscape. Dating the cart ruts has proven difficult. They contain no organic material for radiocarbon analysis, and their open-air exposure complicates stratigraphy. Most scholars place their use somewhere between the Neolithic and Bronze Age, roughly between 3500 and 1000 BCE. This places them broadly within the same cultural horizon as Malta's megalithic temples and later prehistoric settlements. What makes the ruts especially intriguing is their relationship to those temples. In several locations, ruts run close to or directly past temple sites, sometimes appearing to respect sacred boundaries, other times cutting across earlier features. This suggests long-term use across different phases of Maltese prehistory rather than a single brief episode. The limestone geology of Malta plays a central role. The rock is soft when freshly exposed and hardens over time. Repeated pressure from heavy loads could deepen grooves rapidly if the stone was wet or newly cut. This has led to the most common interpretation, that the ruts were formed by wheeled vehicles or sleds transporting heavy materials. Yet this explanation raises problems. No physical remains of wheels from this period have been found on Malta. Turning radii in some rut intersections are extremely tight, impractical for large carts. In places, the ruts run up steep inclines where wheeled transport would be inefficient or dangerous. Some researchers propose sleds rather than wheeled carts, dragged along prepared tracks. Others suggest wooden rollers guided by grooves. These models explain some features, but not all. The network is too extensive, too varied, and too context-dependent to be explained by a single transport method. Another layer of complexity lies in the depth of the ruts. Some are shallow, others are deeply incised, over half a meter deep. In many cases, parallel ruts differ in depth, suggesting uneven loads or prolonged use over long periods. These were not one-time construction marks. They were reused. In coastal areas, ruts extend toward the sea and disappear underwater. This indicates that some were cut when sea levels were lower than today, pointing to considerable antiquity. Their submergence ties the system to climatic and environmental change, not just human activity. The idea of the cart ruts as a functional transport network begins to blur into something broader. Their scale suggests infrastructure, a way of organizing movement across the island. But movement of what? Stone blocks? Agricultural produce? Timber? Or something less tangible? Malta's temple-building culture moves stones weighing several tons, often over considerable distances. Ruts may have facilitated this movement, but temples represent only part of the story. The ruts go far beyond temple zones, crossing open countryside, ridges, and marginal land. This raises the possibility that the ruts were tied to land management rather than monument construction alone. They may mark routes between fields, quarries, settlements, and ritual spaces. In a small island environment, organizing movement efficiently would have been critical. There's also the question of standardization. The consistent spacing between ruts suggests shared conventions. Whatever moved along them was built to a known width. This implies planning, repetition, and collective agreement, hallmarks of organized society. Some interpretations move beyond pure function. The ruts may have held symbolic significance, embedding movement into landscape as memory. Repeated journeys along the same lines would reinforce social routines, seasonal cycles, and territorial boundaries. In this view, the cart ruts become a form of landscape architecture, not a structure you enter, but a system you inhabit through motion. Paths carved into stone turn movement itself into a ritualized act. This idea gains weight when considering how ruts interact with natural features. They sometimes align with the ridgelines or follow contours rather than taking the most direct route. In other places, they deliberately cross valleys or climb slopes, suggesting priorities beyond efficiency. The rut's relationship with water is also notable. Some appear to channel rainwater, though this is likely a secondary effect rather than primary intent. Still, the interplay between cut stone and water flow would have been observed and understood by their makers. Importantly, the cart ruts were not maintained indefinitely. Many fell out of use, filled with soil, or were abandoned as new patterns of settlement emerged. Later cultures did not continue cutting them at the same scale. Whatever system produced them eventually ended. Why it ended remains uncertain. Changes in technology, social organization, or land use may have rendered them obsolete. The collapse of Malta's temple culture around 2500 BCE may also have disrupted the practices that sustained the network. What remains today is fragmented. Modern roads cut across ancient lines. Fields obscure connections. Urban expansion erases context. Tepesialk, the ziggurat remains. Iran. On the edge of the central Iranian plateau, near the modern city of Kashan, two low mounds rise from an otherwise open landscape. They don't dominate the horizon. They don't announce themselves as monuments. And yet, beneath these layers of earth lies some of the earliest experiments in monumental architecture anywhere in the ancient world. This is Tepesialk, a site that preserves the remains of one of the earliest known proto-ziggurat structures. Tepesialk is not a single settlement, but a sequence of occupations spanning thousands of years, from the late Neolithic through the early Bronze Age. This long continuity makes it invaluable. Instead of a finished city frozen in time, Sialk shows process, how architecture, belief, and social organization gradually took shape. The site consists of two main mounds, the northern mound, representing earlier occupation, and the southern mound, where later and more complex structures appear. It is here, on the southern mound, that archaeologists identified the remains of a stepped, elevated platform, often described as a ziggurat precursor. Dating to around the late 4th millennium BCE, this structure predates the classic Mesopotamian ziggurats by several centuries. It was not built with fired brick or monumental stone. Instead, it was constructed from mud brick, layered carefully to create a raised terrace form. This choice of material reflects both environment and intention. Mud brick was abundant, adaptable, and ideal for building upward in stages. Unlike later ziggurats with sharply defined tiers and temples crowning their summits, the Sialk structure appears more restrained. Its elevation is modest, its edges are softened by time, but the principle is unmistakable. Height mattered, elevation mattered, separation from the surrounding ground was intentional. The function of this early ziggurat-like structure remains debated. There is no evidence of domestic use, no hearths, no storage pits, no signs of everyday activity. Instead, its position within the settlement and its distinct construction suggest a ritual or communal role. This was a place set apart. What makes Sialk especially important is its timing. This structure emerges before fully developed states, before writing, and before large-scale urbanization. Monumental architecture here does not express imperial power. It expresses collective focus. Around the raised platform were domestic buildings, workshops, and burial areas. Life continued at ground level while ritual space rose above it. This vertical distinction represents a profound conceptual shift. Architecture was being used to organize belief spatially, to lift certain activities out of daily circulation. Artifacts found at Tepesialk reinforce this interpretation. Pottery becomes increasingly standardized and symbolic over time. Decorative motifs appear. Metalworking emerges, including early copper objects. Craft, a specialization suggests growing social complexity. Burials associated with later phases show differentiation, but not extreme hierarchy. This suggests a society experimenting with organization rather than enforcing rigid control. The ziggurat-like platform fits this pattern. It centralizes ritual without concentrating power in a visible elite. The landscape around Sialk also matters. Kashan lies near trade routes linking the Iranian plateau with Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Ideas, materials, and practices moved through this region. Tepe was not isolated, it was connected. This raises an important point. Monumental religious architecture did not emerge in a single place and spread outward unchanged. It arose independently in multiple regions, shaped by local conditions and shared human impulses. Sialk represents one of these parallel experiments. Over time, the structure fell out of use. Later construction phases shifted focus. Eventually, the site was abandoned, its mud brick architecture eroding and collapsing into layered mounds. Unlike stone monuments, Sialk did not survive intact. Its preservation depends on careful excavation rather than visual dominance. Modern archaeology reconstructed the site's significance through stratigraphy. Layer by layer, brick by brick. What appears today as a low mound once represented an elevated sacred center, visible and meaningful to its builders. Standing at Tepe Sialk now, the experience is quiet. There's no towering ruin to confront. Meaning must be imagined through understanding rather than spectacle. This subtlety is part of the site's power. It reflects an early stage in architectural thought, when elevation was symbolic but not yet exaggerated. The Sialk ziggurat remains challenged the assumption that complex religious architecture required centralized states. Here, a community invested effort into a shared focal point long before kings ruled cities from palaces. As the 13th chapter in this journey, Tepe Sialk bridges earlier communal spaces like Jerf el Amr with later monumental traditions of Mesopotamia. It shows the moment when ritual space began to rise. Not dramatically, but deliberately. This was not architecture of domination. It was architecture of distinction. A way of saying that some actions, some beliefs, belonged above the ordinary flow of life. The people of Sialk did not leave texts explaining their intentions. What remains is form, elevation, and placement. Through these, a quiet innovation becomes visible. Here, on the Iranian plateau, long before ziggurats towered over cities, humans began lifting belief upward, one layer of mud brick at a time. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel, Wyoming, USA. High in the Bighorn Mountains of present-day Wyoming, near the tree line where weather changes without warning, and the horizon stretches in every direction, a ring of stones rests on an exposed alpine ridge. There are no walls here, no roofs, no enclosures, nothing blocks the sky, and yet, this place is one of the most carefully ordered ceremonial landscapes in North America. This is the Bighorn Medicine Wheel. The Medicine Wheel sits at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. Reaching it even today requires effort. In the past, access would have been seasonal, limited by snow and weather. This isolation is significant. The site was not part of everyday life. It was a destination, a place people traveled to with intention. The structure itself is deceptively simple. A central stone cairn anchors the design. From it, 28 stone spokes radiate outward to a circular rim roughly 25 meters in diameter. Around the perimeter sit smaller cairns, placed at intervals. The stones are unshaped, gathered locally, and laid without mortar. Precision here is not expressed through cutting, but through placement. Archaeological evidence suggests the wheel was built and modified over a long period, likely beginning around 1200 CE, with later additions continuing into the historic period. This was not a single construction event. It was a living site, adapted by successive generations who understood and respected its layout. The number of spokes has drawn particular attention. 28 closely matches the lunar cycle, and many researchers believe the wheel was used to track time through moon phases and seasonal change. Others point to solar alignments. Certain spokes and peripheral cairns align with the rising or setting sun during the summer solstice. There are also stellar alignments. Some lines correspond with the rising of specific stars, including Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius, celestial markers that would have appeared at predictable times of year. For plains and mountain cultures, these stellar events signaled seasonal transitions critical for hunting, gathering, and ceremony. What matters is not whether the wheel functioned as a precise observatory in the modern sense. What matters is that sky observation was embedded into the landscape. Time was not abstract. It was visible, repeatable, and shared. The term medicine wheel itself is a modern label, but the concept of medicine in many indigenous traditions refers not to healing alone, but to power, balance, and connection. Medicine wheels are understood as places where the physical, spiritual, and cosmic intersect. For the indigenous nations connected to the site, including the Crow, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, and others, the Bighorn medicine wheel remains sacred. Oral traditions describe it as a place of vision quest, fasting, prayer, and renewal. Offerings left at the site, including cloth bundles tied to cairns, reflect practices that continue into the present. This continuity is crucial. Unlike many ancient sites discussed in this documentary, the medicine wheel was never fully abandoned. Its meaning adapted, but it did not disappear. Colonization disrupted access and understanding, but it did not erase memory. The wheel's design reinforces inclusivity rather than control. There are no barriers, no thresholds. One does not enter a building. One steps into open space. The sky remains dominant. Human construction frames experience without enclosing it. The choice of location amplifies this effect. At this elevation, clouds move quickly. Wind is constant. Light shifts dramatically throughout the day. These conditions heighten awareness of time and presence. Ceremony here would have been shaped as much by environment as by ritual. Unlike monumental architecture elsewhere, the medicine wheel doesn't seek permanence through mass. Its stones are modest. Many could be moved by a single person. Its endurance comes from maintenance and respect rather than weight. Stones were reset, cairns repaired, order preserved through care. This approach reflects a different relationship with architecture. The wheel was not built to dominate land, but to mark relationship with it. It did not claim ownership. It acknowledged alignment. The site also resists hierarchy. There's no privileged viewpoint, no elevated platform for authority. All participants share the same sky, the same circle. Meaning emerges through position and timing, not elevation. Scientific archaeology and indigenous knowledge systems often approach the medicine wheel differently, but both recognize its intentionality. The alignments are real. The placement is deliberate. The site is not accidental. Standing at the wheel today, one becomes acutely aware of exposure. There's nowhere to hide from wind or weather. This vulnerability is part of the experience. Ceremony here required endurance, patience, and attention, qualities central. To many Plains spiritual traditions, the Bighorn medicine wheel challenges assumptions about what constitutes advanced knowledge. There are no calculations carved into stone, no instruments, and yet the builders understood cycles of sun, moon, and stars well enough to embed them into a lasting form. As the 14th chapter in this journey, the medicine wheel introduces a different architectural language, one that does not rely on enclosure, elevation, or monumentality. Instead, it uses openness, repetition, and alignment. This is architecture as relationship rather than object. The stones do not speak loudly. They do not explain themselves. They mark positions and wait for the sky to do the rest. Here, on a high ridge in the Bighorn Mountains, ancient people shaped a place where earth and sky could meet in rhythm. And long after their names have faded, that rhythm still returns. With every solstice, every rising star, and every careful step into the circle. The Dolmen of Menga, Spain. On the plains of Antequera in southern Spain, a low earthen mound conceals one of the most astonishing feats of Neolithic engineering in Europe. From the outside, it appears restrained, almost unassuming, but step inside and scale changes instantly. Massive stone pillars rise from the ground, supporting capstones so large they seem to defy balance. This is the Dolmen of Menga, a monument that challenges not only how ancient people built, but how they understood landscape itself. The Dolmen of Menga dates to around 3700–3600 BCE, placing it among the earliest monumental tombs in Europe. It was constructed long before metal tools were available, in a society still organized around early agriculture and shared ritual traditions. And yet, its builders moved stones weighing over 180 tons, among the largest ever used in Neolithic architecture. Menga belongs to the tradition of passage tombs, but it immediately breaks expectations. Unlike most tombs of this type, its passage is unusually wide and tall. The interior feels less like a tunnel and more like a hall. 7 massive orthostats line each side, capped by enormous lintels, with 3 interior pillars added to support the roof. A rare and significant architectural decision. These pillars matter. Most Neolithic tombs rely on sidewalls alone. At Menga, the builders recognized the limits of stone and compensated by introducing vertical supports. This is not symbolic improvisation. It is structural intelligence. The builders understood weight, pressure, and load distribution with remarkable clarity. The roof slabs are among the largest stones ever moved by prehistoric Europeans. Transporting them would have required coordinated labor on an extraordinary scale. Timber sleds, rollers, earthen ramps, and precise timing. This was not a one-day effort. It was a long-term project that demanded commitment across the community. Menga's purpose is commonly interpreted as funerary, and human remains were indeed found inside. But burial alone does not explain its form. Smaller tombs served that function just as effectively. The scale here suggests something more. A monument meant to endure, to anchor identity, and to assert presence in the landscape. That relationship with landscape becomes clear when considering orientation. Unlike most passage tombs in Atlantic Europe, which align with the rising or setting sun, Menga faces directly toward a natural mountain, Peña de los Enamorados. This prominent rock formation dominates the horizon and resembles a reclining human face when viewed from the plain. This alignment is extraordinary. It suggests that the builders oriented the monument not toward the sky, but toward the land itself. The mountain was not background scenery. It was part of the monument's meaning. Architecture here does not isolate ritual from environment. It binds them together. The mountain likely held symbolic significance, perhaps associated with ancestry, origin myths, or territorial identity. By aligning the tomb toward it, the builders embedded the dead within a broader sacred geography. Death was not a departure. It was a return. The interior experience of Menga reinforces this interpretation. Light fades quickly as one moves inward. Sound becomes muted. The space feels grounded rather than elevated. Unlike tombs aligned to solar events, there's no dramatic burst of light on a specific day. Instead, the monument maintains a steady relationship with its surroundings, emphasizing permanence over moment. The mound covering the tomb once added another layer of meaning. It sealed the structure, insulated it, and reshaped the ground itself. Menga was not placed on the landscape. It became part of it. Nearby lies the dolmen of Viera and the tholos of El Romeral, forming the Antequera megalithic complex. Together, these monuments show variation within a shared tradition. Menga stands apart for its scale and orientation, suggesting a special status within this ritual landscape. The construction of Menga implies social organization without visible hierarchy. There are no palaces, no fortifications, no elite dwellings associated with the tomb. Authority here appears collective, expressed through shared labor rather than imposed control. Later cultures encountered the monument and left it intact. Romans, medieval inhabitants, and modern settlers did not dismantle it for stone. This continuity suggests enduring respect. Even when its original meaning was forgotten, its presence commanded caution. When archaeologists began systematic study of Menga in the 19th century, they immediately recognized its uniqueness. Subsequent research confirmed what scale alone suggests. This was not an experiment. It was a confident expression of architectural knowledge. Standing inside the dolmen today, the weight is palpable. The stones do not feel decorative or symbolic in the abstract. They feel physical. Gravity is present. Time is compressed. The monument communicates through mass rather than imagery. Menga challenges assumptions about prehistoric belief. It shows that meaning was not always projected upward toward celestial events. Sometimes it was grounded, tied to specific features of land that defined identity and memory. As the 15th chapter in this journey, the dolmen of Menga reinforces a key theme. Monumentality was not uniform. Different societies emphasized different relationships, with sky, with ancestors, with land. Here, stone was used to anchor community to place, to bind the living and the dead to a mountain that had watched over them for generations. The builders left no inscriptions, no myths carved into walls, but they left alignment, scale, and orientation. And through those choices, Menga continues to express its purpose with clarity. This was not a tomb meant to disappear into the past. It was a statement meant to remain, and beneath its massive capstones, that statement still holds, heavy, deliberate, and inseparable from the land it faces. Pourbajan Fortress, Tuva, Russia. In a remote mountain lake on the Siberian steppe, an island of stone and earth sits isolated by water, ice, and distance. For most of the year, it is inaccessible. In winter, the lake freezes solid, turning the island into a white, silent expanse. From above, its outline is unmistakable, a rectangular walled complex laid out with precision, far from any city, road, or known center of power. This is Porbajin, one of the most enigmatic architectural sites in northern Asia. Porbajin lies in the Republic of Tuva, near the Mongolian border, over 2,300 meters above sea level. The name means clay house in the local Tuvan language, but the structure is anything but simple. Rectangular defensive walls enclose an area of roughly 7 hectares, forming a near-perfect grid. Towers mark the corners, gates align symmetrically. Inside, foundations outline courtyards, halls, and smaller rooms. At first glance, Porbajin resembles a fortress. High walls, corner bastions, controlled entrances, but its isolation immediately raises questions. There's no nearby settlement, no agricultural base, no clear strategic advantage. This is not a fort guarding a road or a border. It stands alone. Archaeological evidence dates the site to the mid-8th century CE, during the height of the Uyghur Khaganate, a powerful nomadic empire that controlled much of Central Asia after the fall of the Turkic Khaganate. The most widely accepted theory attributes Porbajin to the reign of Bayanshir Khan, a Uyghur ruler known for adopting foreign architectural and religious ideas. The layout of Porbajin is strikingly similar to Tang Dynasty Chinese palace complexes. Rectangular courtyards, axial symmetry, gate placement, and internal zoning all follow Chinese planning principles rather than steppe traditions. This is highly unusual. Nomadic cultures typically favored portable architecture. Porbajin is rigid, permanent, and formal. This mismatch lies at the heart of the mystery. If Porbajin was a fortress, it was poorly placed. If it was a palace, it was impractically remote. If it was a city, it lacked population support. None of the obvious categories fully explain it. Excavations reveal that many interior buildings were made of wood atop clay and brick foundations. Evidence of roof tiles, painted walls, and decorative elements suggests the site was once refined, rather than purely functional. This was not a rough military outpost. It was designed to be orderly and impressive, yet signs of long-term habitation are minimal. There are few domestic artifacts, little evidence of cooking, craft production, or sustained daily life. This suggests that Porbajin was not occupied continuously, or perhaps never fully completed. One leading interpretation is that Porbajin functioned as a ceremonial or religious complex rather than a military one. During the 8th century, the Uyghur elite briefly adopted Manichaeism, a religion originating in Persia and spreading eastward along Silk Road networks. Manichaean monasteries often followed enclosed symmetrical layouts, similar to what is seen here. If Porbajin was a religious retreat or ceremonial center, its isolation makes sense. Separation from everyday life would have reinforced spiritual purpose. The lake itself may have been symbolic. Water as boundary, purification, or cosmic separation. Another theory suggests the site was a seasonal palace, used briefly during summer months. The high altitude would have made winters brutal. Ice and snow would isolate the island completely. Short-term occupation aligns with the lack of domestic debris. Environmental evidence supports this. Permafrost beneath the site has shifted over time, causing walls to collapse inward. Wooden structures burned or decayed early, possibly due to fire shortly after construction. Some researchers believe the site was abandoned within decades of being built. There's also evidence of fire damage, but no signs of siege. This suggests deliberate burning or accidental destruction rather than warfare. If Porbajin was tied to a specific ruler or religious phase, its abandonment may have followed political change rather than military defeat. The choice of location remains one of the strongest clues. Lake Terekol is remote even by Siberian standards. Transporting materials here would have required immense effort. Clay, timber, tiles, and laborers had to be moved across difficult terrain. This was not convenience. It was intention. Porbajin was meant to be separate. Its symmetry reinforces this idea. The site is inward-facing. Walls define space sharply. Movement would have been controlled through gates and courtyards. This is architecture designed to structure behavior, not adapt to environment. Unlike steppe architecture that flows with landscape, Porbajin imposes order on it. Rectangles cut into wilderness, geometry placed in isolation. This contrast may itself be symbolic, a statement of authority, belief, or alignment with foreign models of power. What makes Pourbaix especially haunting is its silence. No later cultures reused it. No city grew around it. The island was abandoned and forgotten, preserved only by cold and distance. When Russian explorers encountered it in the 18th century, it was already a ruin. Modern archaeology has revealed much, but not motive. We know who likely built it. We know roughly when. We know how. But the why remains unresolved. Standing on the island today, the scale feels deliberate but incomplete. Walls enclose emptiness. Courtyards lead nowhere. Foundations suggest activity that never fully materialized. It feels like a place paused mid-intention. Pourbaix represents a different kind of ancient mystery. Not one buried by time, but one isolated by choice. A site that resists explanation because it does not fit expected patterns. It reminds us that architecture is not always driven by practicality. Sometimes it expresses aspiration, an idea imported from elsewhere, tested briefly, then abandoned. Pourbaix may have been a palace without a court, a monastery without monks, or a fortress without enemies. Its exact role may never be known, but its existence tells us something essential. Even nomadic empires experimented with permanence. Even steppe rulers imagined enclosed, ordered worlds set apart from movement and trade. Here, in the middle of a cold Siberian lake, stone walls outline a moment when belief, power, and foreign influence converged, briefly, deliberately, and then vanished. The island froze. The empire changed. The walls remained. Sangom Nara, Coral Stone Foundations, Tanzania. Off the southern coast of Tanzania, where the Indian Ocean meets mangrove-lined channels and tidal flats, the ruins of a forgotten town lie scattered across a small island. Walls rise only a short distance from the ground. Doorways open onto empty courtyards. Mosques stand roofless, their orientation still precise. This is Sangom Nara, one of the best preserved Swahili settlements on the East African coast, and a place where architecture reveals a sophisticated urban world, built almost entirely from coral stone. Sangom Nara flourished between the 14th and early 16th centuries CE, during the height of Swahili maritime culture. At this time, the East African coast was not peripheral. It was central to Indian Ocean trade, linking Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. Gold, ivory, iron, ceramics, and textiles passed through coastal towns like this one, carried by monsoon winds and seasonal currents. What distinguishes Sangom Nara from many other Swahili sites is its state of preservation. Unlike towns continuously occupied and rebuilt over centuries, Sangom Nara was abandoned relatively quickly. This left its layout intact, frozen at the moment when its social and architectural systems were fully developed. The town was carefully planned. Coral stone houses are arranged along narrow streets and open courtyards, forming distinct neighborhoods. These were not improvised dwellings. They followed shared design principles that reflected social hierarchy, privacy, and daily ritual. Coral stone was the material of choice. Quarried from nearby reefs, cut while still soft, and hardened through exposure, coral was lightweight, workable, and abundant. When bonded with a lime mortar made from burned coral, it formed durable walls, well suited to the humid coastal climate. The foundations of Sangom Nara's buildings reveal this expertise. Walls were thick, often reinforced at corners and doorways. Floors were plastered with lime, creating smooth, cool surfaces. Drainage channels directed rainwater away from living spaces. Architecture here was not decorative excess. It was environmental intelligence. At least 40 stone houses have been identified, ranging from modest residences to larger, more elaborate structures belonging to elite families. These elite houses feature multiple rooms, internal courtyards, latrines, and decorative niches. Space was carefully managed. Public and private zones were clearly separated. Mosques anchor the town spatially and socially. Sangom Nara contains several mosques, each oriented toward Mecca with precision. Their placement within neighborhoods suggests that religious life was integrated into daily movement rather than centralized into a single monumental complex. One of the most striking features of the town is its abundance of tombs. Elaborate coral stone tombs, some decorated with inscriptions and carved details, are interwoven with residential areas. The dead were not removed from the city, they remained present within it. This proximity reflects Swahili attitudes toward ancestry and memory. Tombs mark lineage, status, and continuity. They were not hidden, they were visited, remembered, and incorporated into urban life. Archaeological finds at Sangomanawa reinforce its role in global exchange. Imported ceramics from China, Persia, and India have been recovered, alongside local pottery and glass beads. Coins minted in Kilwa, the powerful Swahili city-state to which Sangomanawa was connected, indicate participation in a monetized economy. Yet, despite this wealth and connectivity, Sangomanawa lacks fortifications. There are no defensive walls enclosing the town. This absence suggests confidence rather than vulnerability. Protection came from networks, alliances, and maritime knowledge rather than stone barriers. The town's sudden abandonment in the early 16th century coincides with the arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. Disruption of trade routes, violence, and political upheaval destabilized Swahili city-states. Sangomanawa was not destroyed in battle. It was left behind as systems that sustained it collapsed. Because it was abandoned rather than rebuilt, Sangomanawa preserves something rare, an African stone town largely untouched by later modification. Its coral foundations remain readable, doorways still frame movement, streets still guide the eye. Standing among the ruins today, the scale feels intimate. Buildings are human-sized, streets are narrow. The town does not overwhelm, it invites attention to detail. Thresholds worn smooth, niches placed deliberately, walls shaped to guide airflow and light. Sangomanawa challenges outdated assumptions that sub-Saharan Africa lacked urban complexity before European contact. Here was a literate, Islamic, mercantile society with advanced architecture, international trade, and a distinct cultural identity rooted in both Africa and the wider Indian Ocean world. The coral stone foundations are key to this story. They reveal permanence without monumentality, wealth without excess, order without central domination. Sangomanawa shifts the narrative into the medieval world, not of castles and cathedrals, but of coastal towns built on trade, belief, and adaptation. This was a city shaped by tides rather than rivers, by winds rather than roads. Its architecture reflects movement, exchange, and connection rather than isolation. The ships are gone, the markets are silent, but the foundations remain. Ollantaytambo, the wall blocks. Peru, in the sacred valley of the Andes, where the Urubamba River bends between steep mountain walls, a fortress temple rises in terraces and stone. From a distance, Ollantaytambo appears orderly, geometric, and unmistakably Inca. But as one approaches its upper platforms, attention is drawn not to the terraces or stairways, but to the stones themselves. Massive blocks fitted with astonishing precision form walls that feel less constructed than resolved. This is Ollantaytambo, and its wall blocks represent one of the highest expressions of Inca stone engineering. Ollantaytambo was more than a fortress. It was a planned town, a ceremonial center, and a strategic stronghold guarding the entrance to the sacred valley. Unlike many Inca sites that feel isolated or symbolic, Ollantaytambo functioned as a living settlement. Its streets, drainage channels, and residential blocks are still in use today, following the original Inca grid. Above the town rise the monumental constructions that define the site, particularly the Temple of the Sun complex. Here, the stonework changes character. Walls are no longer built from smaller fitted stones, but from enormous blocks of pink rhyolite, some weighing over 50 tons. These stones were quarried from the mountains across the valley and transported to their current position with no wheels, no metal tools, and no draft animals. The blocks are polygonal, each face cut to match its neighbors exactly. Joints are so tight that even a blade cannot be inserted between them. There's no mortar. The stability comes entirely from shape, weight, and precision. This is not decorative craftsmanship. It is structural mastery. One of the most striking aspects of the Ollantaytambo walls is their subtle variation. No two stones are identical. Each block has multiple angles, planes, and edges. The stones appear to interlock, distributing stress across the wall. This design increases resistance to earthquakes, a necessity in the Andean region. The builders clearly understood how stone behaves under pressure. Instead of stacking blocks in uniform rows, they created a system where weight presses inward, locking the structure together. The walls flex slightly during seismic activity, then settle back into place. This knowledge was empirical, gained through generations of building in a volatile landscape. Transporting the stones remains one of the most discussed aspects of Ollantaytambo. The quarry lies several kilometers away, across the Urubamba River and up steep slopes. Archaeological evidence suggests the Incas used ramps, rollers, ropes, and coordinated labor, likely moving stones during seasonal periods when manpower was available through the Maida system of communal work. Some stones show unfinished faces and protrusions known as bosses, knobs left intentionally during transport. These features would have allowed ropes to be attached or stones to be levered into position. In some cases, the bosses were never removed, suggesting construction was interrupted. This interruption aligns with history. Ollantaytambo was one of the last strongholds of Inca resistance against the Spanish. The site witnessed a rare Inca victory when forces led by Manco Inca flooded the plains below, forcing Spanish troops to retreat. Construction at the upper temple appears to have halted around this time. As a result, Ollantaytambo preserves a moment frozen in process. Some walls are complete, others remain partially built. Stones lie abandoned along transport routes, offering rare insight into Inca construction methods. The orientation of the Temple of the Sun adds another layer of meaning. The wall blocks are aligned toward significant mountain peaks, apuis, considered living deities in Inca cosmology. Architecture here is not isolated from belief. It is positioned within it. Water management further demonstrates the integration of engineering and ritual. Channels carved into stone direct water across terraces and through ceremonial areas. Water was sacred to the Incas, associated with fertility, mountains, and the origins of life. Guiding it precisely through stone was both practical and symbolic. The contrast between the town below and the monumental stonework above reflects Inca social organization. Everyday life operated within ordered, functional spaces. Ritual and authority occupied elevated ground, marked by labor-intensive construction. Height, stone quality, and access differentiated roles without separating the community entirely. The wall blocks themselves communicate permanence. Their scale exceeds necessity. Smaller stones could have served the same functional purpose. The decision to use massive blocks was deliberate. Scale conveyed stability, endurance, and connection to the mountains from which the stone was taken. Standing before these walls today, one becomes aware of restraint. There is no carving, no imagery, no inscriptions. Meaning is carried through precision alone. The walls do not depict power, they embody it. Ollantaytambo challenges the idea that advanced engineering requires written mathematics or metal tools. The Incas achieved extraordinary accuracy through measurement, experience, and collective knowledge passed orally and practically. Their architecture was not theoretical. It was tested, refined, and proven in stone. Ollantaytambo represents a peak, not just an altitude, but an architectural confidence. Here, stone is no longer merely material. It is language. These walls were not built to be understood quickly. They reveal themselves through close attention, through noticing how angles meet, how joints disappear, how weight settles. The longer one looks, the more intentional they become. The builders are gone. The empire fell, but the stones remain exactly where they were placed, resisting time, weather, and seismic force. In Ollantaytambo, architecture does not explain itself. It stands. And in those silent wall blocks, perfectly fitted and impossibly heavy, the Inca understanding of land, labor, and permanence continues to speak, without words, without ornament, and without compromise. Göreme the rock-cut structures, Cappadocia, Turkey. In the heart of Cappadocia, where volcanic rock has been sculpted by wind and water into cones, ridges, and valleys, an entire human landscape was carved directly into stone. Homes, churches, monasteries, storage rooms, and tunnels were not built here. They were hollowed out. This is Göreme, a place where architecture disappears into geology, and survival, belief, and community became inseparable from the land itself. Göreme's origins stretch back to the Roman and early Byzantine periods, roughly from the 4th century CE onward, though earlier use of Cappadocia's soft volcanic tuff dates back even further. What distinguishes Goreme is not a single monument, but density. Hundreds of rock-cut spaces cluster across valleys, cliffs, and hillsides, forming a living settlement network rather than an isolated complex. The material made this possible. Cappadocia's tuff is soft enough to carve when exposed, yet hardens when sealed from air. This unique geology allowed entire interiors to be excavated using simple tools, while still remaining structurally stable for centuries. Stone here was not a barrier, it was shelter. The earliest rock-cut dwellings were practical. Single rooms carved into cliff faces provided insulation against extreme temperatures. Cool in summer, warm in winter, small openings limited wind and visibility. In a region vulnerable to raids and political instability, invisibility offered protection that walls could not. As Christianity spread through Anatolia, Göreme took on a new role. Persecuted communities used the valleys and rock churches as places of refuge and worship. Chapels were carved into stone, their interiors shaped into apses, naves, and domes that echo above-ground basilicas, but without foundations, columns, or timber. What makes Göreme extraordinary is the scale of this transformation. Entire monastic communities developed underground and within cliff faces. Multi-level complexes include refectories, kitchens, living quarters, chapels, burial chambers, and storage rooms, all connected by narrow corridors and stairways cut into rock. Many churches were decorated with frescoes painted directly onto stone walls. Biblical scenes, saints, and symbolic motifs cover interiors that remain surprisingly vivid. These paintings were not meant for public display. They were devotional, intimate, and enclosed, reinforcing the inward focus of Göreme's spiritual life. The layout of these spaces reflects controlled movement. Entrances are low, corridors are narrow. Light is limited. Progress through a complex is deliberate. Architecture here slows the body and quiets the senses. This was intentional. Worship was meant to be immersive, not theatrical. Defense was embedded into design. Some complexes include rolling stone doors, hidden entrances, and escape tunnels. While Göreme itself is not one of the massive underground cities nearby, it forms part of a wider defensive landscape that allowed populations to disappear into rock when threatened. Importantly, Göreme was not only religious, it was lived in. Families occupied carved homes. Animals were sheltered in lower chambers. Grain, wine, and oil were stored in sealed rock rooms. Life unfolded vertically and inward rather than outward. Water management reveals further sophistication. Channels were carved to guide rainwater into cisterns. Drainage prevented erosion. Even waste disposal was planned. These systems show that Göreme was not an emergency refuge alone. It was sustainable habitation. Unlike stone cities built upward to display power, Göreme represents the opposite impulse. Architecture here avoids dominance. It seeks protection, continuity, and adaptation. The settlement blends so completely into the landscape that it becomes difficult to distinguish human from natural form. This invisibility also shaped social organization. There were no monumental palaces or public squares. Authority was localized. Communities were small, interconnected, and resilient rather than centralized. Power did not rise above others. It retreated inward. Over centuries, Göreme evolved. As political conditions stabilized, some rock dwellings were abandoned. Others were reused. New churches were carved beside older ones. Fresco styles changed, reflecting theological shifts. The landscape became layered with time rather than replaced by it. Eventually, above-ground settlements became dominant again. Rock structures fell out of daily use, preserved by abandonment rather than destruction. Unlike cities rebuilt repeatedly, Göreme remained intact because it was left alone. Standing in the valleys today, the effect is disorienting. Openings appear where none should exist. Rooms hide behind natural curves. Churches emerge from cliff faces without warning. Architecture is everywhere and nowhere. Göreme challenges basic assumptions about building. It shows that architecture does not require construction. It can emerge through subtraction. By removing stone rather than stacking it, humans created space, order, and meaning. As the 19th chapter in this journey, Göreme introduces a radically different relationship between humans and material. Stone is not shaped into form. It is emptied into function. This approach reflects a worldview shaped by uncertainty, political instability, religious persecution, environmental extremes. Rather than asserting control, Goreme adapts. The people who carved these spaces left no architectural treatises, no inscriptions explaining method. What remains is practice, repeated, refined, and shared across generations. Here, architecture is quiet. It does not announce itself. It waits to be entered. And in those carved chambers, cool, shadowed, and enduring, Goreme preserves one of the most complete examples of how humans learned not just to build on land, but to live inside it. Mesa Verde, the cliff structures, USA. High on the sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, entire villages were built into the rock itself, not hidden underground, not placed on open ground, but suspended between sky and canyon. From below, they appear unreachable. From above, almost invisible. These are the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, among the most sophisticated architectural achievements of the ancestral Pueblo people. Mesa Verde, meaning green table in Spanish, is a vast plateau in present-day Colorado, cut by deep canyons and alcoves formed naturally by erosion. For centuries, this landscape offered protection, water access, and concealment. Beginning around the late 12th century CE, communities here made a decisive architectural shift, moving from open mesa-top villages into cliff alcoves. This was not a gradual change. It was intentional, rapid, and widespread. The cliff structures are not crude shelters. They are planned settlements containing dozens, sometimes hundreds of rooms. The most famous Cliff Palace contains over 150 rooms and more than 20 kivas. Others, like Balcony House and Longhouse, reveal similar complexity. These were not emergency hideouts. They were permanent communities. Construction relied on sandstone blocks, shaped and stacked with mortar made from mud and ash. Wooden beams supported roofs and floors, carefully fitted into rock sockets. The alcoves themselves provided natural ceilings and back walls, reducing the need for freestanding construction and offering protection from weather. What makes Mesa Verde remarkable is how architecture adapts perfectly to geology. Walls follow the curve of alcoves. Rooms are staggered vertically to maximize space. Windows and doorways are small, conserving heat and limiting visibility from outside. Everything is scaled to human movement, not display. Central to these communities were kivas, circular, subterranean ceremonial rooms. Even within cliff dwellings, kivas were dug downward, reinforcing their symbolic connection to emergence, ancestry, and the underworld. Ritual life was not abandoned when people moved into the cliffs. It intensified. Daily life at Mesa Verde was demanding. Water had to be collected from seeps and springs. Food was grown on mesa tops above and carried down. Access routes involved narrow ledges, hand and toe holds carved into stone, and wooden ladders that could be removed. Movement itself was regulated by architecture. This difficulty raises an obvious question. Why move here at all? Archaeological evidence suggests multiple pressures converged. A prolonged drought reduced agricultural yields. Population increased. Competition for resources intensified. Moving into cliff alcoves offered defensibility, controlled access, and proximity to reliable water sources. But defense alone does not explain the scale or care of construction. The cliff dwellings reflect social reorganization. Households clustered tightly. Storage. Rooms increased. Shared spaces became more central. Architecture encouraged cooperation, visibility within the community, and controlled interaction with outsiders. Importantly, these structures were not meant to last forever. By the late 13th century, Mesa Verde was gradually abandoned. People migrated south toward the Rio Grande and into present-day Arizona and New Mexico, where descendant Pueblo communities still live. There's no evidence of catastrophic destruction, no mass violence. The departure appears planned and orderly. Rooms were sealed, ladders removed, ritual closure took place. Mesa Verde was not lost, it was left. This intentional abandonment is key. The cliff dwellings were solutions to a specific moment in time. When conditions changed, the solution changed too. Architecture adapted and then moved on. The preservation of Mesa Verde is owed largely to this abandonment. With no later reuse, the structures remained intact, protected by their alcoves. When they were encountered by outsiders centuries later, they appeared frozen in time. Standing inside a cliff dwelling today, The experience is intimate and exposed at once. Walls are close. Openings look out over vast canyons. The sense of enclosure and height exists simultaneously. Architecture here balances security and openness with remarkable precision. Mesa Verde challenges the idea that complexity requires permanence. These communities invested immense effort into structures they knew might not endure indefinitely. What mattered was effectiveness, not longevity. Mesa Verde reinforces a recurring theme. Ancient architecture was often reactive, adaptive, and situational. It was not always about domination or legacy. Sometimes it was about survival with dignity. The ancestral Pueblo people did not carve their names into stone. They did not build monuments to power. They built places to live, gather, and worship under difficult conditions. And they did so with skill, restraint, and foresight. The cliffs still hold their rooms. The ladders are gone. The voices are silent. But the architecture remains exactly where it was needed most, suspended between land and sky, reminding us that some of the most extraordinary human structures were built not to be seen from afar, but to work perfectly where they were placed. Mesa Verde endures as a record of adaptation, not just to environment, but to change itself. Chanquillo, the Solar Towers, Peru. In the coastal desert of northern Peru, where rainfall is scarce and the horizon stretches uninterrupted, a line of stone towers crowns a low ridge. They are evenly spaced. They do not enclose space. They don't support roofs or walls. Instead, they stand in sequence, 13 markers set against the sky. This is Chanquillo, the earliest known solar observatory built in the Americas, and one of the clearest examples of time transformed into architecture. Chanquillo dates to around 300 BCE, centuries before the rise of the Inca Empire. It was constructed by a complex society whose name is unknown, but whose understanding of the sky was precise, systematic, and deeply integrated into ritual life. This was not astronomy for curiosity. It was astronomy for survival, belief, and social order. The 13 towers stretch across the ridge like teeth on the horizon. From specific observation points to the east and west, the rising or setting sun appears to move along this line throughout the year. On the summer solstice, it rises at one end of the sequence. On the winter solstice, it rises at the other. On every day in between, the sun aligns with a different gap or tower. This arrangement turns the horizon itself into a calendar. Unlike monuments that mark a single event, Chanquillo tracks the entire solar year. It does not celebrate one day. It measures all of them. With nothing more than stone markers and observation points, the builders created a system capable of identifying solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal progression with remarkable accuracy. The towers themselves are not massive. They vary in height and shape, adjusted to compensate for the uneven ridge. This variation is deliberate. Each tower's profile ensures consistent visual alignment from the observation points. Precision here is optical rather than structural. 2 main observation platforms have been identified, one to the east, one to the west. From these points, a trained observer could determine the date by watching where the sun rose or set along the towers. Time was not counted. It was seen. This visual system would have been especially important in a desert environment. Agricultural cycles depended on seasonal timing. Ceremonial calendars structured social life. Authority may have rested with those who understood and maintained this knowledge. Chanquillo is not just an observatory. It is part of a larger complex that includes fortified structures, plazas, and corridors. Nearby stands a hilltop enclosure with thick walls and restricted access. This combination of astronomy and controlled space suggests that solar knowledge was linked to power and ritual. The fortified structure does not resemble a typical military installation. Its layout is inward-facing, with narrow entrances and internal pathways. Some researchers interpret it as a ceremonial center rather than a fortress, a place where rituals tied to solar events were performed. This pairing matters. Chanquillo does not isolate science from belief. Observation and ceremony existed together. Understanding the sun was not separate from honoring it. Unlike later Andean solar traditions that emphasized temples and idols, Chanquillo's approach is abstract. The sun is not depicted. It is tracked. The towers do not represent deities. They mark positions. This abstraction suggests a sophisticated conceptual leap. Time is not mythologized alone. It is systematized. What makes Chanquillo especially significant is its completeness. Earlier structures elsewhere mark solstices or cardinal directions. Chankilo records the entire annual solar cycle, something no other known ancient site achieved so clearly and so early. And yet, after several centuries of use, Chankilo was abandoned. The reasons remain uncertain. Environmental change, social disruption, or political collapse may all have played roles. The site shows signs of deliberate closure rather than violent destruction. Later cultures did not reuse the towers. They stood unused, gradually eroding into the desert. Without continual observation, their purpose faded from memory. Standing at Chankilo today, the experience is subtle. The towers are low. The desert is quiet. Without knowledge of the alignments, the site appears almost minimal. But once the system is understood, the simplicity becomes its strength. This is architecture that does nothing unless the sky participates. At sunrise or sunset, the system comes alive. The sun touches stone. Gaps align. The year reveals itself through position rather than inscription. Chankilo challenges the idea that advanced astronomical knowledge requires complex instruments. Here the landscape itself is the instrument. Stone marks reference. Human perception completes the system. As the 21st chapter in this journey, Chankilo represents a turning point. Architecture is no longer primarily about enclosure, burial, or defense. It becomes measurement. Time is given form. The builders of Chankilo left no text explaining their methods, no calendars carved into stone. What they left instead was alignment, a system that works only if understood and maintained. In that sense, Chankilo was not just built, it was taught. Knowledge had to be passed on for the site to function. When that chain broke, the towers fell silent, but the sun still rises and sets along the ridge. The alignments still hold, and for a few moments each day, the desert remembers what these stones were made to do. Here, long before clocks or calendars, humans learned to read the year written across the horizon and carve that understanding permanently into the land. Çatalhöyük, Anatolia, Turkey. On the Konya plain of central Anatolia, far from mountains and coastlines, a low mound rises from flat land that once bordered marshes and seasonal watercourses. There are no walls, no streets, no visible monuments. And yet, beneath this mound lies one of the most important experiments in human settlement ever discovered. This is Çatalhöyük, a place where people learned to live together at scale, long before cities, states, or formal hierarchies existed. Çatalhöyük was occupied between roughly 7400 and 6000 BCE, during the Neolithic period. At its height, several thousand people lived here simultaneously. This alone makes it extraordinary, but what truly sets Çatalhöyük apart is how they lived, and what they chose not to build. There are no streets at Çatalhöyük. Instead, houses were packed tightly together, sharing walls. Movement happened across rooftops. Entrances were through the ceiling, accessed by ladders. From above, the settlement would have looked like a continuous mass of flat roofs, a human-made plateau. This arrangement was not accidental. It created security without walls, privacy without isolation, community without central authority. Architecture here did not separate people. It bound them together. Each house followed a similar plan: rectangular rooms with plastered walls and floors, hearths for cooking and warmth, raised platforms used for sleeping, working, and ritual. These platforms were also where the dead were buried. At Çatalhöyük, ancestors were placed beneath the floors of homes. The dead remained within daily life, under beds, beneath platforms, within walls painted and repainted over generations. Death was not removed from the household. It was integrated into it. Walls inside many houses were richly decorated. Murals depict animals, hunting scenes, abstract symbols, and geometric patterns. Some walls show repeated repainting, layer upon layer, suggesting that images were renewed rather than preserved, meaning here was cyclical, not fixed. One of the most famous images from Çatalhöyük appears to show a settlement beneath an erupting volcano, possibly Mount Hassan nearby. If so, it may be the world's earliest landscape representation. Whether symbolic or literal, it shows that people here were thinking about place in complex, abstract ways. Animal symbolism is everywhere. Bulls, leopards, birds, and wild cattle appear in reliefs and paintings. In some houses, real animal horns were embedded into walls and platforms, transforming architecture into ritual space. These were not separate temples. Homes were temples. Despite its size, Çatalhöyük shows little evidence of social hierarchy. Houses are remarkably uniform. There are no palaces, no elite districts, no monumental buildings set apart from others. Wealth, if it existed, was not expressed architecturally. This absence is striking. Large populations elsewhere quickly produce hierarchy. At Çatalhöyük, they did not, at least not in stone or space. Authority may have existed, but it was not enforced through architecture. Craft production was advanced. Obsidian tools were produced in large quantities and traded widely. Beads, figurines, baskets, and textiles show skilled specialization. Yet workshops are not segregated. Production happened within households. Food came from a mixed economy of farming, herding, and foraging. Wheat, barley, peas, and lentils were cultivated. Sheep and goats were herded. Wild resources were still exploited. This balance reduced dependency on a single system and allowed flexibility. Fire, smoke, and light shaped daily experience. With roof entrances and interior hearths, smoke would exit through openings above. Light filtered downward. Houses were dark, warm, enclosed. The sensory environment was carefully controlled by design. Over time, houses were abandoned, filled in, and built over. New homes rose directly atop old ones, preserving memory vertically rather than horizontally. The settlement grew upward, layer by layer, forming the mound archaeologists excavate today. This rebuilding process was deliberate. Old walls were respected. Burials were not disturbed. Continuity mattered. Place mattered more than novelty. Eventually, after more than a millennium of occupation, Çatalhöyük was abandoned. The reasons remained debated. Environmental change, shifting trade routes, social transformation. What is clear is that the settlement did not collapse violently. It was left. Standing at Çatalhöyük today, there is no skyline to impress, no single monument to frame a photograph. Meaning emerges slowly, through repetition and density, through understanding how every house mirrored the next. Çatalhöyük challenges a core assumption about civilization, that cities require rulers, streets, and monuments. Here was a large, stable population living together without any of those things. Architecture at Çatalhöyük did not express power. It expressed coexistence. As the 22nd chapter in this journey, Çatalhöyük reframes everything that came before. After towers, temples, observatories, and fortresses, we return to something quieter, a city without hierarchy, where ritual lived inside homes and the dead rested beneath the living. This was not a society striving upward. It was one expanding inward. The people left no king's names, no written laws, no monuments to victory. What they left instead was a model, fragile, rare, and deeply human. At Çatalhöyük, civilization did not begin with walls or rulers. It began with shared roofs, shared space, and the decision to stay together.